Hello everyone, this is Briscoe, and this is part 2 of a 3-part series regarding implicit bias. In this video, we will actually discuss implicit bias in higher education. So what is implicit bias, specifically in higher education? Implicit bias is defined as attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. In higher education, implicit bias often refers to unconscious racial or socioeconomic bias towards students. Instructors can hold assumptions about students' learning behaviors and their capability for academic success, which are tied to students' identities and/or backgrounds, and these assumptions can impede student growth. Let's examine a number of examples of implicit bias that we often would see in higher education. These examples are provided by Yale University Poorvu Center for Teaching and Learning. Example 1. Instructors may assume that certain students know to seek help when they are struggling, although students at higher risk for struggling academically are often actually less likely to seek help and support. Another example, instructors may assume that students from certain backgrounds and social groups have different intellectual abilities and/or ambitions. A third example, instructors may expect students who speak with certain accents to be poor writers. A fourth example, students with substandard writing abilities may be stereotyped as lacking intellectual ability. Another example, instructors might treat students with physical disabilities as if they may also have mental disabilities and thus require more attention. Students are affiliated with a particular identity group may be treated as experts on issues related to that group. Instructors may assume that students will best relate to the historical, contemporary, or fictional character who resembles them demographically. And then the last example, students of certain groups may be expected to have certain participation styles. So in examining those examples, perhaps maybe you don't resonate with all of them, or if any of them, but maybe you know someone who does. And so in recognizing that we really all do have implicit biases, how do we counter those? The Center for Teaching and Learning from Yale has some recommendations that they would put forth for those in higher education. As you see on the screen, there are 4 different strategies. One is to self-assess implicit biases. You can do these in 2 different ways. A reflective teaching method is one. Perhaps as somebody that you're one to journal and reflect on your writing. Perhaps that is a way for you to self-identify what biases that you have in a higher education setting. Another way is to utilize the online self-assessment from Harvard University, which is known as Project Implicit. Personally, I have actually utilized this self-assessment myself, and I have found it to be highly beneficial. It's very thorough. I encourage anybody to utilize this resource. Another strategy that the Center for Teaching and Learning has recommended is to cultivate inclusivity. There are a number of ways to do this, particularly in a classroom. Some examples are to utilize students with the proper names, and preferred pronouns in a classroom setting. A third strategy is to solicit feedback from outside observers. Perhaps allow a colleague, a peer, or someone from the Center for Teaching and Learning to come and visit your classroom, observe your student-teacher interactions, and then provide you feedback. A fourth strategy is to solicit feedback from students. Perhaps you would like to utilize your midterm or end-of-term course evaluations, or maybe even have small group feedback sessions. So after reviewing the examples and the recommendations of how to counter those implicit biases, it's important that we recognize what implicit biases we have. These questions are going to challenge you to examine what implicit biases you have in your higher education setting. I encourage you, as we look through these questions, feel free to pause the video and reflect on your own as we go through them. So reflect on your role and responsibility in higher education. How can you relate to the examples regarding implicit bias? What takeaways can you learn from hearing the examples of implicit bias? How can you encourage your peers in higher education to consider their own implicit biases? How does implicit bias exist in your staff selection process? How does implicit bias exist during your staff training? How does implicit bias exist among what activities and events are being provided to your students? What policies and procedures exist that reflect your implicit biases? How does implicit bias exist in your classroom setting? Please take some time to process and reflect on these questions, and feel free to pause the video. Thank you for taking the time to reflect and process on the questions. Now, as important as it is to identify our own implicit biases, it's also important to understand how do we counter those. Please take the time as we look through these questions. Feel free to pause the video if you must, but reflect and process how can you counter the implicit biases with the recommendations for the Center of Teaching and Learning from Yale University. In your role and responsibilities in higher education, how do you counter your implicit biases, or how could you? How could you in your staff selection process? How could you during your staff training? Perhaps among the activities and events that are being provided to your students. Perhaps what policies and procedures exist at your institution. And then also, how do you counter your implicit biases that you have in your own classroom setting? Please take the time to process and reflect these questions, and feel free to pause the video. Thank you for taking the time to process and reflect. I encourage you, as an opportunity for professional development, gather with your peers and your colleagues and share what you reflected throughout this video, and discuss with your peers and colleagues collectively as a group, and share what you learned and discovered about yourself. For more information, these are my resources for part 2 of the 3-part series of implicit biases. Thank you.